So I can't remember how many times I've sat in this room over the last 7 or 8 years. I can't remember how many discussions I've participated in about the state of the legal profession and in Brazil over the last 40 years. But I will echo David's and say this was one of the most fascinating discussions I've sat in Brazil or on these topics in any of the countries we visited, and even at the Harvard Law School, David. So I think this really is an amazing experience and a tribute to the school and the faculty and the people that Luciana and her colleagues have brought together. So and I'm supposed to summarize all of this, right? And I've been given about 10 minutes or something like that. If I manage to say anything coherent and interesting, it's because I've been taking notes on what is a fantastic discussion, and if I can catch 10% of it and feed back to you some of what you've said, I'll consider that I have been extremely successful. So I think that what I want to talk about, obviously, is the bridge between the discussion of what's happening in the Brazilian economy and Brazilian political life, Brazilian society, Brazilian law, and the research project that we are undertaking. So this is a little bit of a bridge from today's session, which is the open discussion about what is going on, to tomorrow, where we actually sit down and talk about a research design with the smaller team that is focusing on the actual research. So I think that it's interesting because several of the the discussions just in the last hour or so have recognized that there are two big forces, or maybe three, but two big forces recently, and these go against the background of a third big change in Brazil, which is democratization and the transformations that Bruno so brilliantly summarized. But the most recent things are globalization and technology. We talk about globalization, but you realize that technology is something that's fostered by globalization, but is independent of globalization. And we have to see that these two things are coming together, that these are two things are coming together. And they change the market for legal services. They change the way legal services can and can be delivered and are being delivered, and they create complexities that we didn't have before. So new markets, new modes of production, new complexities. There are new demands for services. There are new ways to deliver services. There are new cost structures. The death of the hourly rate, my God, how can this be? This has been going on since, I think, in Hammurabi's day, they had hourly rates. Only they didn't have hours, but they had hourly rates, and more competition. So what I said earlier, I want to echo, which is that boundaries have become contested. Marx said, "All that's solid melts in air." That's, I think, a phenomenon of the capitalist system, and I think we're seeing a particular moment of a set of boundaries. They haven't melted yet, but they're contested. So contested boundaries, the boundaries between areas of law within a country, between junior and senior lawyers, between local and global norms, between what's law and what's not law, between what's legal knowledge and what's other kinds of knowledge, between foreign lawyers and local lawyers, between the client and the lawyer, between the house counsel and the outside firm. Maybe one of the most important changes within the legal system is that shift. Certainly, I think that because that shift helps drive a lot of other shifts, including the cost structure issue, the competition issue, the way legal services are demanded. Barclays recently put out a call for firms to compete for a certain range of business, and they required that the bids include outsourcing from the firm to lower cost providers of anything that could be outsourced. Required, right? That's the general counsel mandating the way the firm runs its business. And then finally, between the universities in one country and universities around the world, as we try to rethink the boundaries between local knowledge about law and global knowledge about law. So these boundaries have become contested, and we've heard some of the contests. Some of them are, of course, right at the moment in Brazil, a little bit more acute than others, but all of these boundaries and all these issues of where to draw, how to redraw these lines, or whether to redraw these lines, and there's no easy answer to any of these questions. There's no, as we used to say in the Army, there's no school solution. There's no place you can go and say, oh yes, here's the boundary redistricting, right? Even on the internet it can't be found, believe it or not. You Google, how do I fix my boundaries, and it says, who knows? There are multiple stakeholders, and this is part of the complexification. Because, as we've heard today, we've got the firms, we've got government, we've got the bar, we've got the schools, we've got the students, and we have, not last but not least, the clients, right? And I'm sure, and the NGOs, and who knows, and perhaps the New York Giants, what do I know? Los Angeles team, too. So there are these tremendous fluminenses for local consumption. This tremendous number of players who are involved in, not each set of players, not all players in each boundary debate, but as these boundaries get redefined. These players are in there. Choices must be made, right? The speed up that people have mentioned, you can't sit around and say, well, why don't you do this, because the pressures of globalization and technological change are so great, the competition that has generated internally, globally, are so great that there's no luxury of sitting around and debating forever. So choices must be made. Firms must be restructured. Unbundling must be explored. House counsel must change what they do. The kind of people who become House counsel will change. Hiring of lawyers is going to change, or many of these changes are occurring, have occurred. Law schools have to change. They have to think about specialization. They have to think about adding international expertise. They have to learn to do research in ways that deals with how to solve the problems of today, rather than the doctrines of Italy of yesterday, which used to be something that a lot of time was invested in certain law schools, not too many miles away from here, but no names will be mentioned. They have to figure out how to get business.
Not Facebook tomorrow.
Huh?
This will be on the Facebook.
I did a review. I once did a review of the Department of Civil Law of the University of São Paulo, and it was the Museum of Old Italian Legal Theories. Quite interesting. I hope I'm not insulting any graduates of that department. You have to learn how to integrate business knowledge with legal knowledge. We had this discussion about maybe don't do the MBA, get it all in one law school. Well, that sounds fine, right? Or don't do a degree in business and FGV solve that problem. I'm not quite sure you've solved all those problems. But it's no easy job to do that, and to do it well, and to do it in a short period of time with children. I mean, with people who are 17, 18, 19 years old. To deal with the proliferation of things that look like law, but maybe they're not law, or they're soft law, or they're private law, and maybe more important than state law. This is kind of not an urgent issue, but if you want to export ethanol to the European Union, assuming that you had a surplus of ethanol to produce, you will find that your ability to export to the European Union is going to be determined by something called Bon Sucro, which is a private certifying body which will certify that your ethanol meets EU standards. Is this law? Is it not law? Well, you better know about it if you work for UNICA, let me tell you that. Whether you call it law or not, they think it's law. So there's all this to be added and put together. What can research do? Luckily, David has made clear, and I don't have to do that, we're not omnipotent. In fact, barely know what's going on. So what can we do? So we can collect data. But you know, data is kind of boring. I mean, data is a good start, but if we don't know what to do with it, it's not very useful. So we have to know what data to collect for what reason, and we have to know the principles that we're looking at, the things that we're concerned about to which the data can speak. If we believe that the building of local competence on global legal issues is an important issue, we'll collect data on that. But we have to decide that first. So there are principles and priorities that we have to think about. And I think while we cannot settle those issues for a country, for a bar association, for a law school, we can at least list what the options are. We can identify choice points. I just mentioned a whole bunch of them in a very general way. They can be narrowed down to more particular choice points for specific institutions and countries and bars and so on. And we can help illuminate the choices. And so I think that helping define the choices and helping illuminate the choices is really what a project like this can do. So I'm going to do something that may get me in trouble, but I'm going to finish by giving you an example of what a research project that tries to identify choice points, develop some principles, or at least identify what principles are at stake, collect data, and illuminate choices might be. And this is the issue of creating a law school, of how legal education might respond to some of this boundary. So let's say that some hypothetical law school in some emerging market, we won't give it a name, decides that really there's a need to train more lawyers to operate in a modern, global, dynamic environment. This could happen in many countries. And so they so what do they have to do? They will have to define what are the skills that are needed. They will have to define the inputs that are required. They will have to define how to measure the results of this. They will have to figure out how to add a lot of content that has not been present. They will have to figure out how to recruit and maintain the kind of sophisticated professors who can deal with this. All of this could be identified. We could identify these needs. I think that we're beginning to do this. And then we could begin to look at the costs of doing this in this hypothetical. So the costs are just a sheer economic costs. All of a sudden, we will be able to point out, I think, that to do this costs a lot more in financial terms than the legal education that it supersedes. It just can't. You can't do all this at the same price that you were doing much less. This doesn't. You don't have to be Keynes to figure that out. All right. So then we can begin to say, well, what are the implications of those costs and these choices? And then we see issues arise, and these issues are already arising in our discussion. What will it do to social stratification in the country? If the costs are borne by the students, that means that the students will have to be recruited from the most elite part of the segment of the population. If the costs are paid for by the government, then other sort of stratification issues may be on the table, or if there's some third source of funding. But those are the sorts of issues that can be laid out and identified. What happens to the social? What happens to social issues? There is a debate in the sociology of the legal profession about this issue. If global law schools emerge in the emerging economies and respond to the purely economic pressures that we have listened to, what does that do to the attention of those schools to social issues, access to justice, fundamental rights? There are two schools of thought. There's the school of thought that it will crowd, that the business economic changes will crowd out. If there ever was commitment to these things, it'll get crowded out. And then there's the argument that actually it's the opposite, that these two things are mutually supportive. And there's a whole set of books that try to argue one side and the other. I don't know the answer to this. I'm fascinated by the question. Can we answer this in an ultimate sense? I'm sure we won't. But we can at least illuminate by looking at what is going on and providing data about what schools are doing, like this one, and other schools of this nature in the emerging economies. That's all we can do. And then we leave it to everybody to say what to do about this. The same set of issues we could take the same question about this issue of foreign lawyers. Who wins and who loses by these regulations? Do the lawyers win? Do the clients win? Do the clients lose? Which lawyers within a given system? My colleague John Onosorch, who works in China, just sent us a message, and he says, you know, in China, it's very complicated because there'll be some people who will gain by more restrictions, and others in the Chinese bar who will lose by further restrictions. They're relatively open, as you know, relatively speaking. So that he says, we've got to do a cost-benefit analysis. We've got to see where these costs fall, not the dollar or the renminbi cost, but the cost of the transformation. Somebody is going to get an advantage out of the existing. Some people are benefiting from the existing system. The changes will change the distribution of the costs and benefits. What are they? Of course, this isn't a perfect science, but we can begin to identify those questions. So I think for legal education, for foreign lawyers, and for all the many questions that we will try to deal with, there are ways to identify some of the implications of the choice without advising on which choice to make and without reaching any definitive conclusion. I think we can help the people who actually make the choices, whether they be bar associations, governments, deans, general counsel, or senior partners of law firms. We can at least make a modest contribution to making their lives a little bit easier to deal with a time of maximum complexity and contestation of boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor David Trubek. I just want to say some words in the end of this long day with a lot of discussion and with a mix of different legal practice and how globalization impacted them in a very differently way. And what is the GLI goal, and is in some way to face to the challenge and to produce data, although data is boring, and although
data alone is boring.
Is not.
I love data.
and it's not common, but I am one of the professors here in DIREITO GV with teach with data and we stimulate my students to read them with some kind of criticism or with enough criticism to understand what is happening in these emerging economies and especially deal with the globalization. And so it's just my final words. Tomorrow we will have more work with the Brazilian team, and I would like to thank you, each of one from the Brazilian team and each of one participants and speakers that come today, especially Luciana Ramos and Lígia Sica, because without them this event is not possible. Thank you very much. And just to finish this day, I'd like to invite Oscar.
I just would like to thank, first of all, Luciana, who put all this together for us. And, I just would like to say one thing about the first conversation that we had about this research. What, a year ago or a little more than that? And it was an amazing conversation that I think was reflected on the results of this first phase of the enterprise, which was, I remember talking with David that, okay, we would participate on that if we could join you in designing the research. We are not here for collecting that data, since data is the issue.
We love it.
And David said, that would be fantastic. And this was the beginning of a good conversation. And I think the level of respect that senior researchers, I'm not now talking about north-south tensions. I'm talking about seniority in academia and how respectful you have been, David, also, with a young faculty that is proud of what they're doing here, and a school that in this complexity, without the level of information that probably we will never get to a good level of information, has to take decisions the whole time. And then simplicity means have some principles to follow, and I think be guided by these principles with the best level of information that you have. So I would like to thank those who invited us to be on this research with this level of responsibility. And I hope we are delivering, and I think what we saw here today is that we are delivering exactly what we agreed upon some time ago.
No, you're overproducing. You're way over your quota.
Okay. So thank you. Congratulations for all of you.